The air inside the Supreme Court chamber was heavy with formality. Marble walls, polished mahogany benches, and a strict silence that had the weight of centuries behind it. Reporters lined the gallery, their pens poised. This wasn't a place for theatrics. But today, something different was about to happen. As the double doors opened, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the man entering. He didn't wear a tailored suit or a lawyer's badge. He wore a plain black blazer, no tie. His hair, long and swept behind his ears, was unmistakable. The murmurs started immediately. Is that Keanu Reeves? What is he doing here? Justice Samuel Alito adjusted his glasses, visibly annoyed. He turned to his clerk and whispered something. A slight chuckle escaped his lips. When Keanu reached the center of the room and stood quietly, hands at his sides, Alito leaned forward with a smirk. Mr. Reeves, this is not a movie set. This is the United States Supreme Court, he said, voice tinged with condescension. Keanu didn't blink. He simply nodded. I understand, Your Honor. From the press section, a few cameras clicked. Everyone waited for him to mess up. But Keanu didn't speak like an actor. He opened a leather folder and placed a single sheet on the lectern. I'm here on behalf of the late Jacob Heller. A veteran. A father. A citizen whose constitutional rights were stripped under Executive Order 1429. The atmosphere shifted. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Justice Elena Kagan raised an eyebrow. And you're representing him, as what? Counsel. Keanu responded calmly. As the executor of his estate. And a citizen with standing under Article 3. I am here because no one else would speak for him. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward. You do realize that this is a constitutional challenge, Mr. Reeves? Keanu nodded. I do. And I intend to argue it. The room fell silent again. For a moment, it felt like everyone was waiting for the punchline. But it didn't come. Instead, Keanu continued, citing the 5th and 14th Amendments verbatim. He didn't read. He recited. Word. For. Word. The justices exchanged glances. He memorized the Constitution, one clerk whispered. Justice Alito interrupted. Mr. Reeves, quoting text isn't the same as legal reasoning. What precedent do you believe invalidates the executive order? Keanu's eyes didn't flinch. Youngstown Sheet Tube Company v. Sawyer, 343 U.S. 579, 1952. A case that limits presidential authority during emergencies without congressional approval. Now it was Clarence Thomas who looked intrigued. Keanu added, the order bypassed due process, seized private assets, and silenced dissent under the guise of national interest. That's not security. That's suppression. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was electrified. No one expected that from the man who played Neo. In that moment, Keanu Reeves wasn't a movie star. He was a citizen who had just dared to speak constitutional truth to the highest bench in America. And they were listening. By the time Keanu Reeves walked out of the Supreme Court building, the sidewalk was chaos. Cameras. Microphones. Protesters. Supporters. News vans parked on the lawn. Reporters screamed his name. Mr. Reeves, are you seriously defending a constitutional case? Are you being coached by someone? Who's behind this? Keanu didn't speak. He raised his hand gently and walked through the crowd, flanked by 2 pro bono attorneys from a veterans advocacy group. He didn't need to answer, the clip of his courtroom performance was already everywhere. By nightfall, the video had over 20 million views on X. Hashtags like #ConstitutionalKeanu and #NeoGoesLegal were trending worldwide. Cable news anchors couldn't decide what to call it. A publicity stunt gone right? An Oscar-winning performance or a genuine legal crusade? In a candlelit room in Georgetown, Judge Samuel Alito sat alone, rewatching the video. Pause. Play. Rewind. He focused on Keanu's calm demeanor, his unshaken cadence, his clear citations. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Meanwhile, Justice Sonia Sotomayor met with Justice Elena Kagan in private. Did you notice how he built the argument? No theatrics. Just law, Sotomayor said. Kagan nodded. He studied. Deeply. That wasn't memorization. That was comprehension. Kagan added quietly, if his standing holds, this could trigger a national review of Executive Order 1429. At the same time, President Miller's legal team convened in emergency session. If the court decided to hear Keanu's full motion, it could set a precedent that threatened every power extension granted during the previous national emergency. Across the country, public opinion shifted overnight. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Civil liberties organizations published open letters praising Keanu's courage. Even late-night talk shows, initially amused, began treating the case with serious tone. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this sounds like the plot of a movie, but Keanu Reeves just walked into the Supreme Court and made 6 justices question a federal order, joked one host. And I think he might win. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed quiet. No press conferences. No tweets. He spent the evening at a local VFW hall with Jacob Heller's widow, listening to her story. He didn't talk about the Constitution. He asked about her husband's dreams. His service. His loss. The next morning, Chief Justice Roberts released a statement. The court will hear Mr. Reeves's full constitutional argument in open session. A single sentence. But it hit like a thunderclap. The date was set for 1 week later. Inside the legal community, one question echoed. What happens if Keanu Reeves is right? Because now, it wasn't just a celebrity moment. It was the beginning of a legal reckoning. 7 days. That was all Keanu Reeves had to prepare for the most consequential oral argument in modern Supreme Court history. But he wasn't in a law library. He was in a modest community center in D.C., surrounded by veterans, volunteers, and stacks of handwritten affidavits. No legal team. No speechwriters. Just Keanu, reading, absorbing, asking. He didn't rehearse lines. He listened to stories. The widow of a farmer who lost his land under the executive order. A disabled Marine whose pension was seized in a national emergency fund freeze. Each voice was another layer in his argument. Meanwhile, the government prepared its counterattack. Behind closed doors, the Solicitor General's team planned to challenge his standing. He's not an attorney. He has no law license. He's an actor, one aide said. But he's the executor of the estate, another pointed out. Technically, he has the right to speak. Then we question the estate. The process? We paint him as an outsider meddling with national security. News networks began picking up anonymous leaks. Keanu Reeves funded by political activists? Hollywood elite interferes in federal law? The smear campaign spread quickly. Pundits debated his motives. One anchor said, "This isn't a legal crusade. It's celebrity vanity." Another responded, "Then why is he refusing interviews? Why is he digging through archives instead of walking red carpets?" Public trust teetered on a knife's edge. But in the background, something extraordinary happened. A retired appellate judge named Linda Foster, once a clerical assistant in the Youngstown v. Sawyer case, sent Keanu a handwritten letter. It read, "You're the first citizen in 50 years who stood in that courtroom not for power, but for principle. Don't let them spin you. Keep speaking." The next morning, Keanu showed up at the Supreme Court early. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore the same black blazer. Waiting for him at the entrance was Jacob Heller's daughter, Olivia, 12 years old, holding a manila envelope. "My dad wrote this. Before he passed. He said if anyone ever fought for him, they should have it." Keanu opened it. Inside, Jacob's handwritten timeline of how his home was seized, how the military came at night, how no court ever heard his case. It was raw. Personal. Undeniable. Keanu whispered, "This is Exhibit A." As they entered the courthouse, a protest crowd had gathered. Not in anger, in solidarity. Posters read, "Truth matters more than titles. We are all Jacob Heller. Let Reeves speak." Inside the building, Justice Alito looked out the window. He muttered to himself, "This isn't how it's supposed to go." Meanwhile, Keanu stood outside the courtroom door. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not to rehearse, but to remember. He wasn't fighting as an actor. He was fighting as a citizen. And the nation was starting to listen. The chamber was packed. For the first time in decades, the Supreme Court gallery had a waiting list. Law professors flew in from Europe. Retired judges requested reserved seats. Even a handful of senators sat in the back row, silently observing. But the man who commanded the entire room stood alone, no legal team, no co-counsel, no teleprompter. Keanu Reeves stepped to the lectern, the same leather folder in his hand. He began quietly. "Your Honors. I stand here not as an attorney, but as a citizen. I'm not asking for celebrity privilege. I'm asking for constitutional accountability." Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward. "We remind you, Mr. Reeves, this is a forum of law." Keanu nodded. "So let's talk law." He opened the folder and laid out 3 exhibits. 1. The executive order text. 2. The affidavit from Jacob Heller's estate. 3. A handwritten letter from a Supreme Court law clerk from 1952, one who had witnessed the Youngstown decision firsthand. "Exhibit C," Keanu said, holding it up, details how unchecked executive power nearly cost this nation its legal backbone during the Korean War. That letter is not precedent, but it is prophecy. Justice Kavanaugh interjected. Do you believe an actor can truly understand the implications of wartime powers and constitutional law? Keanu looked him dead in the eye. Justice Kavanaugh, I was paid to pretend. That's acting. But what I've lived, seen, and researched in the past months, that's reality. And reality is what the Constitution is meant to protect. The audience stirred. Justice Sotomayor asked, what, in your view, was the government's gravest error in this case? Keanu didn't hesitate. Silencing voices through seizure. A veteran's home isn't a threat. It's a sanctuary. When the government strips that away without judicial review, we don't just lose property, we lose the promise of America. A pause. Justice Alito stared at him, tapping his pen. And what would you have this court do, Mr. Reeves? Overturn an order designed to protect national security? Keanu's reply was calm. I would have this court remind the nation that security and liberty are not enemies. And that laws made in fear rarely age well. That line stopped everything. Reporters began scribbling madly. Justice Barrett whispered something to Justice Thomas. Even Justice Roberts took a long breath. In closing, Keanu stepped away from the lectern. He pointed not to the justices, but to the Constitution framed on the wall. My argument is not mine alone. It belongs to every citizen who was ever told they were too small, too poor, or too quiet to be heard here. Today, I ask this court not to hear me because I'm famous, but because I'm right. He walked back to his seat. No one clapped. No one moved. But the silence roared. Outside, the crowd waited. They had no idea what had just happened. Inside, the Supreme Court was no longer a chamber of dismissal. It had become a chamber of doubt. And Keanu Reeves, the man mocked as a Hollywood outsider, had just made the Constitution feel alive again. The ruling wouldn't be announced for weeks. But the nation didn't wait. By the next morning, universities added Keanu's argument to their law curriculum. A Harvard professor called it the most eloquent constitutional defense by a layperson in living memory. Civil rights groups launched nationwide campaigns demanding a review of Executive Order 1429. In Portland, a mural of Keanu pointing to the Constitution went viral. The caption read, "Not a lawyer. Still right?" Meanwhile, Justice Alito found himself flooded with letters. Some were angry. Some were grateful. But most asked the same question. Why did you mock him before he spoke? Alito didn't answer. Instead, he rewatched the footage again and again. He wasn't alone. Within the Supreme Court, justices began debating privately. Justice Thomas surprised his peers when he said, "He reminded me of Thurgood Marshall. Not in form, in conviction." Justice Barrett disagreed, citing procedural overreach. Justice Kagan responded, but his logic was airtight. And more importantly, it reflected the people's voice. The justices were no longer weighing just a legal argument. They were weighing public trust. Across town, Keanu remained silent. He declined interviews. Offers flooded in, speaking gigs, book deals, documentaries, all refused. He spent time with Jacob Heller's family, away from the noise. Olivia Heller, the 12-year-old girl who had handed him the envelope, was now an online icon. Her quiet strength became the face of a movement. One morning, she asked Keanu, "Will they listen?" He smiled gently. "They already are." A few days later, something unexpected happened. Chief Justice Roberts invited Keanu to a private meeting. In his chambers, the two men sat across a polished table. Roberts didn't smile. He didn't offer pleasantries. He asked one question. "Why didn't you let someone else argue it? A trained constitutional scholar?" Keanu looked him in the eyes. "Because they wouldn't have cared like I did." Silence. Roberts closed the folder in front of him. "You do realize, if we side with you, it could upend years of legal precedent." Keanu nodded. Sometimes it takes a fault line to see where the cracks already were. Outside the courthouse, protesters now held signs that read, "One man can make them listen. Constitution, career. Truth doesn't need a degree." In Hollywood, award shows awkwardly avoided mentioning the case. In Washington, politicians scrambled to reposition themselves. But in the homes of ordinary Americans, veterans, immigrants, teachers, farmers, something had shifted. Keanu had taken the stage not as a hero, but as a reminder. That even in a system built for the powerful, one voice, calm, steady, informed, could still shake the pillars. The nation waited. And the justices, behind closed doors, faced the hardest decision of their careers. To preserve the precedent. Or to honor the principle. The Supreme Court announced it would deliver its decision at 10 a.m. sharp. By 6 a.m., the sidewalks were full. Reporters, students, veterans, legal scholars, thousands gathered, staring up at the white marble steps like pilgrims before a temple. Inside, the chamber was dead silent. No one knew what the justices would say. There had been no leaks. No hints. Keanu Reeves arrived with Olivia Heller and her mother. He sat quietly in the third row, hands clasped, head lowered. At exactly 10:01, Chief Justice Roberts entered. Everyone stood. When they sat down again, he opened a single envelope and cleared his throat. This court, in a 6-3 decision, finds that Executive Order 1429 violates the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution. A collective gasp swept the room. Roberts continued. Furthermore, we affirm that any government action depriving a citizen of property or liberty without due process shall be subject to full judicial review, even during declared national emergencies. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Then the sound came, soft, muffled sobbing. From the back row. From Jacob Heller's widow. Justice Kagan glanced at her colleagues. It was done. Keanu didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled, like a man who had carried something impossibly heavy, and finally set it down. Outside, the announcement was relayed by phone calls, tweets, live broadcasts. Cheers broke out in waves. Across the country, flags were raised. Bells were rung. Veterans embraced each other in silence. Civil rights lawyers wept on air. One anchor whispered, "I can't believe it, he actually changed the law." The White House released a statement minutes later. "We respect the ruling of the court. The executive order has been revoked." But the moment wasn't about politics. It was about possibility. A man who had no law degree, no government office, no legal title, had stood before the highest court in the land, and won. Later that day, Keanu finally agreed to a short press statement. He stood on the courthouse steps. No citizen should need to be famous to be heard. I hope today reminds every person watching that the Constitution belongs to all of us. And with that, he turned and walked away. No victory speech. No applause. Just silence, the powerful kind. In classrooms, his case was already being dissected. In households, it was being replayed. But in the history books, the chapter had only just begun. They would call it Reeves v. United States. But those who were there knew better. It wasn't about Keanu. It was about a man named Jacob Heller. And a constitution that, for once, listened back. 3 months later. The cherry blossoms bloomed again in Washington, D.C. The city moved on. News cycles churned. Scandals, elections, celebrity breakups. Life, in its chaos, resumed. But something had shifted, subtly, deeply. In a public park near the National Archives, a new memorial stood quietly. It wasn't tall. It wasn't grand. It was a bronze bench, carved with one line. Even silence can be heard, if it's principled. No plaque named the donor. But every day, visitors came. Some sat. Some left flowers. Others left folded flags or court transcripts. At nearby universities, a new course was introduced, Citizen Advocacy and the Constitution, the Keanu Doctrine. Law students debated whether the ruling would hold through future administrations. Constitutional purists and progressives, for once, agreed on one thing. Something rare had happened. Not just a legal win, a moral one. In the Library of Congress, Olivia Heller's handwritten letter to her father was placed in a protected display case. Visitors read it and cried. In Hollywood, an award show presenter joked, "I'd thank the Academy, but Keanu just reminded us what real performance looks like." Even President Miller, whose executive power had been curbed, addressed the nation. He didn't attack the ruling. He praised it. Today, I'm reminded that leadership means listening. And the Constitution still speaks louder than any president. Keanu never returned to acting. He declined roles, turned down documentaries, and politely refused every law school that offered him an honorary degree. He moved upstate, near a veterans' hospice. Volunteered. Read books. Tended a garden. Once, a reporter found him at a local diner and asked, "Do you feel like you won?" Keanu stirred his coffee and replied, "It was never about winning. It was about waking something up." The reporter asked, "What did you wake up?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Memory. Of what this country promised." As he left the diner, he paused beside a young boy reading a newspaper article with his picture on it. The boy looked up. "Are you the guy who talked to the court?" Keanu nodded. The boy asked, "Can I do that too?" He crouched beside him and said, "That's the whole point." Then he stood, walked away into the late afternoon light, Not a movie hero, not a courtroom rebel. Just a man who believed the Constitution could still matter. And because he did, it did.